broadcasters today. Thank you for joining us, Pushback Channel, and please listen to this presentation as you would a radio broadcast. In this essay, I'd like to talk about the issue of changing demographics, racial demographics. Now, I just looked at a new citizen swearing in ceremony in the United States, and there was 100, and at best I could count anyway, 161 people. It's like at a town hall type thing. 161 people that are becoming citizens of the US. So how many white people do you think there would be in that? Half, 20, quarter or so. No, there are a total of 8 people. 8 out of 161 people, 8 white people in total. Just as the looking at it, I sort of get the impression they seem to be Russian, that sort of look, Ukrainian maybe. But fortunately, the microphone was near enough you could hear, and it was moving around. So now the idea is that these people can understand the U.S. Constitution and can swear loyalty and say it in English and that sort of thing. These people did not seem to fall into that category, from certainly what I could hear. So affirmative action is obviously alive and well when it comes to handing out citizenship. They can just say, hey, you're upright and warm, and you fog up the mirror and we hold. So affirmative action and wave through is just as alive and well in citizenship ceremonies as it is in getting higher education and so on in the US. If you're dark skinned, then it doesn't matter. So anyway, now if you look at say there's a main street in Sydney where every several years people take sort of video of that street, and you can see the people. It's not necessarily in an area of say the middle of a tourist area, but it's nonetheless it's in the wider CBD. So now looking at one from say the 1960s, it's all white faces. Then you look at even into the 70s, all white faces, the 80s, all white faces, early 90s, all white faces. Then suddenly in the late 90s, it changes. There's a large number of Asians beginning to appear, not blacks, but Chinese in particular. Shortly after that, say 2008, so a lot of Indians starting to appear. To the point where one did just recently, and I can confirm this by my own visiting, into the downtown area, is that now white people are by far and away the minority in Sydney. So they went from being 99.99%, even as much as 25 to 30 years ago, to now being 15 to 20%. And you can see this pretty much in any Western city. If I look at the same video coming out of London, or the same video coming out of an American city or a Canadian city and so on, it's the same sort of thing. So clearly there's a massive demographic change. Now, I don't know how many of these people have just got work permits, or they're students that are permitted to work a certain amount of time, or whether they're full, they've got citizenship, or what their status is. That's harder to say. And there's a lot of people who can fall into other categories, such as temporary resident visas and so on, or even tourists for that matter. But nonetheless, the demographic shift is absolutely clear, and you don't quite notice it when it's incrementally. It's happens incrementally. It's like the frog sort of boiling in the water. Frog tends not to notice it, but when you see you look at one video after another going on 10-year spans going from the 1960s, there's a real sort of wow factor in that. And of course, that American citizen swearing in ceremony. I had a look at an Australian citizenship ceremony as well. And again, the standards are supposed to be, you're supposed to speak good English and all this sort of thing. These people don't speak good English. They can barely speak a word of English. They're just being gifted citizenship as if it's meaningless and means nothing. Anyway, and the same sort of thing, that there's hardly any white people, or far fewer. Now, with the mass migration going to the West, and I've spoken this a number of times, there's a very small percentage of the these mass migrants are economically viable, that can get jobs, that can produce a tax surplus greater than the resources they consume. There's a very small percentage of them are economically viable. Now, even a generous estimate has it at 5%. And this seems to be pretty uniform around the world. There's a similar study in England recently, or Britain recently, where, and the media don't talk about it and the government keeps it quiet, as they did here in Australia as well, by the way. But the viability of the mass migrants is very low. You're looking at 0.5%, or there, slightly less than 0.5% actually are the rocket scientists, engineers, and doctors that we keep getting told and talked about. Oh, we need all these people because they're rocket scientists. No, they're not. There's one in every 250 is a qualified engineer that has engineering qualifications that are accepted and that are viable. Because, coming from these third world countries, nearly all of these, the Indians and so on, nearly all of them hold degrees have just bribed somebody to get it. They haven't studied and busted their ass and got it any form of merit. Same goes in Pakistan and Africa and all these places. Very, very few. I mean, some inevitably in the overall scheme of things must have, but very, very few have. And only some are required to sit for bridging examinations or study bridging courses and sit for rigorous examinations, which is something that's desperate and urgently needed. So only a very small number have any sort of qualifications. In England, they're even suggesting it's less than 5%. In Australia, the range was between 3 and 5% are economically viable. It's much closer to 3% in England. So we've got this thing happening where mass migration is mass migration of literate peasants. It's not mass migration of rocket scientists, far from it. Quite the opposite, in fact. But when we look at the wider demographic trends of how recent migrants will quickly have a number of anchor babies, and you see it in Australia. You see the third world peasant. She's got a toddler that's barely walking. It's got a juvenile, a baby in a stroller or some sort of a pram, and she's pregnant with another one. So they're making sure the anchor baby thing's really good. So they're having children quickly, and 3 or 4 of them. And you have a look at the rate of migration and the procreation of the migrants and the declining procreation of, because they're looking at a future that appears to be absolutely bleak. White people are hated. Straight white men are just all written off as being literally Hitler. Why would you engage in procreation when the future looks that bleak and uncertain? You wouldn't. But when you come from a third world country where the average GDP per capita is like $1,000 or something, then you think you've arrived in paradise. All this free stuff being given to you, and so they procreate very quickly. But these people will never produce a surplus. Neither they or their children will produce an economic surplus. So they're a terrible drag on the economy. So all the wealth that white people have created in the world, in the modern world, once white people are gone, who's going to create the wealth? Is there going to be anyone around? Is it the Jewish financiers saying, well, hey, we don't care whether it's white people or illiterate black peasants. When we're controlling the finances, as the George Soroses of the world or the Larry Finks of the world, it doesn't matter who we've got running around delivering the Uber Eats or sweeping the floor. It's irrelevant. It's our control of the finances that's going to dictate what happens. And I'm sure that's a view that these people who think they're demigods are pushing ESG and so on. But the reality is that white people will be around 15% of the population in all hitherto, what were previously once all white countries, 100% white, 90% white, that they'll be around 15% of the population. And then the areas of the Indians, the Africans and Pakistanis, all that sort of thing, they're the people that are going to be Chinese. They're the people who are going to be in the majority. So I perceive that within 35 years, there won't be under current trends, there won't be a single single place in the world that is majority white, or even where whites are a significant minority. To be a significant minority, you'd still need to be more than 20 to 25% of the population. And I don't think white people will even be that in 35 years. But having a look at the source of migration, and there's a few sums here. Maybe somebody like Kaiser Bausch can do a deep dive into this and put the time into it that's needed. But when we look at the source of mass migrants, places like Africa, Nigeria, and all that sort of thing, Chad and the likes, and that's on the West African side. On the East African side, places like Somalia and so on. The ratio of population density to arable land, somewhere like Somalia doesn't have much arable land, so their farming sector isn't as big as it might be in a there's lots of arid steppes and desert type conditions in Somalia. So whereas they might only have a population density of 30 odd people per square kilometre, because the arable and livable land is quite small in that in Somalia, then their population density in arable areas or usable land areas is quite high. It's in the in the 400s. So let's have a look at population density relative to per capita GDP. Now, all the countries that are supplying, other than say one-offs like Ukraine and the war there, but all the countries that are supplying the mass migrants outside of warfare, Syria, for example, had a civil war for a while. All those mass migrants come from areas of the world where the average GDP per capita is around the 2000. It can be like 1,700 to say 2,500 US dollars per capita GDP. That's the source of the mass migrants. So that's pretty much all of Africa, or most of Africa. The Indian subcontinent, the entire subcontinent, which you include Afghanistan in, and Pakistan and so on. So those are so if you took, China as well, but if you took out the Indian subcontinent and Africa from mass migration, the mass migration would actually be quite small. So those two areas are really, and they're the areas of huge overpopulation and huge poverty. And they're the big, when I say huge poverty, as in they're insanely corrupt, that they couldn't, that they can't administer, they couldn't run a bath without stuffing it up. These people live in, they're unable, they're failed states, in effect, failed states. Now, some people say, well, look how well Nigeria is doing. Well, I don't know, is it? I mean, it's a horrendously corrupt place with an average GDP per capita of $2,000. And technically, given the amount of farming land they've got and the amount of natural resources they've got, they should be a rich country, but they're not. And nor were they rich when white people turned up. They were reasonably well-to-do while white people were there, and they've gone right down to the bottom again as soon as the white people left. So I don't see Nigeria some shining example of a successful African state, far from it. That they're not a complete basket case failed state is hardly an accolade that could be extended to, look how well they're doing. They're not a basket case failed state. No, that's not a measurement for success. So when we look at population density, say somewhere like Nigeria, 2,200, 2,300 dollars per capita GDP, and they've got a population density of around 230 to 240 per square kilometre, depending on whose numbers you're looking at. They've got a very high birth rate of around 5 births per woman. Bear in mind, a lot of women have multiple sexual partners. So in a sense of, in a procreative sense, they've got quite a matrilineal type society in that structure. So, and again, like the islander cultures around the Pacific Island, because it's quite natural for women to have multiple sexual partners, and monogamy isn't something that they understand or can even get their heads around. or inheritances are through the female line, because it's always the female can also identify, yeah, but I gave birth to that child, therefore that's the only way that you can determine things like inheritance or anything, in fact, is through the matrilineal line, given that she's forgotten and doesn't know how many men she procreated with. So anyway, this is the source. Now, if you look at, say, somewhere in India, 500 people per square kilometre. Pakistan, depending again on whose numbers you're looking at, 350 per square kilometre. Again, very low incomes. Then if you look at sort of Western Europe, Central and Western Europe, the population density is comparable to, say, somewhere like Germany, for example, has around the same population density as Nigeria, but obviously a far wealthier and better organised, better administered and better run country. Now, you look somewhere like the USA, with 38 people per square kilometre. Now, you need to consider, of course, in these numbers, just how much desert, for example, like Australia has a very low population density, but then nearly 2/3 of Australia is arid scrubland and or desert. So, once you factor in the unusable land, as in desert, then you get a greater appreciation of what the actual population density is. And Australia has a number of areas on its coastline near the bigger rivers where the population density is over 200 per square kilometre. I mean, there's small areas that have that population density, but nonetheless, France has a lower population density, again, of around 120. So now, when you look at population density and you look at GDP and overall wealth, there's clearly, a central globalist secretariat that's sitting down deciding on the basis of wealth, population density and economic structure and all this sort of thing, just how many migrants each first world country must take. So there is no question that the globalist secretariat is sitting down saying, okay, Australia, you will take 500,000 a year. Okay, United Kingdom, you will take 1 million a year. All right, France, you will take this much. Germany, that much. Italy, this much, and so on. So everyone's getting its budget. It's illiterate peasant budget is being handed out, quota. And this is how many, and they're doing it like they do affirmative action quotas, to come, you have to hire 100 black lesbians or something. This is how they're doing the mass migration thing. You will have a million illiterate peasants from, but the source of the mass migrants is within a tight range of GDP per capita. Outside of that, the migration is very small. So it's tightly limited into those areas. Now, it can be, as the propaganda goes, well, they just want a better life. That's what they're doing. No. There's a whole globalist infrastructure to encourage them, to incite them, to agitate, to stir them up, to supply all the travel logistics to get them from Africa to the first world. All of this is going on, and all supported and funded by the globalist cabal to move these people in. Now, what's the purpose of it in the end? Only white countries have ever created wealth and have ever made it, have these well-run, well-organised, well-administered, rule of law, societies and free and fair elections, all that sort of thing. Now, the globalists that's no longer needed. That those things. Rule of law, due legal process, free and fair elections, that just gets in the way of the globe. The globalists are imposing the New World Order on the Western countries. And the idea that you get a say in it or you can vote your way out of it, to them would be laughable. You're nothing but the shit on their shoes. And you're just to be kicked out of the way because they've got their program to, their program to implement, and you can just fuck off. Now, how will these countries stay wealthy when you import all these people from all failed states? Every one of these places is a failed state. Now, you can say, well, they're not 100% failed, but they're all failed states. They've all got a per capita income that's 1/10 less, 1/20th of Western per capita income. GDP. So if that's not failed state, and you can have grades, I suppose, of failed state, absolute, total, out of control basket case, or almost an out of control total basket case. It doesn't really matter. They're failed fucking states. So all these people being imported from failed states who've failed to build their own country, who failed to develop their own country, who all come from very high crime areas where elections, rule of law, and all these sort of things are they just don't exist. Bribery and corruption is rampant. That's everything. And you're importing gazillions of these people into the West. And there's this blithe notion that, well, it's not really going to affect anything. And even to the point where it's malicious, where, well, all these people being brought in, at least we'll crush all the white people. We'll crush all those white Christian Gentiles. And that's a good thing. It is? How is it a good thing? Given that these white Christian Gentiles you're crushing invented the entire modern world, every bit of technology, every organizational structure, everything that you use and see around you and touch has been created by these white people that you're trying to eradicate. And you're replacing them with people from basket case failed state countries who've never built anything ever in the history of their peoples or their races. So what is it you're going to achieve by this? And really, all you can, as you look down the tunnel, all you can see here is utter and total calamity. Now, there are those who again, the Larry Finks and the George Soroses think, well, we just control the finance, we pull the strings from afar. Don't worry, everything will be fine. No, it won't. No, it won't. Everything is going to blow up in everyone's face if you do this, and then we'll be left with the world will be left with just a bunch of failed state illiterate peasants running around, creating the same mayhem in their new countries they've arrived in as they did in their old places. Notice that the blacks that were taken from slavery, taken from Africa, sold by their African brethren to the white traders. They've been in the United States at the very least, say, for 200 years, minimum 200 years they've been in the United States. Quite a decent chunk of them for 300 plus years. And they've been, they haven't been, many of them, by the way, especially in the north and northeast of the United States, many of them were already free, even when the Civil War was on. So we're talking hundreds of thousands were already free. And they'd served like an indenturement almost and had received their freedom at the end of the period. So, and they had they were in various businesses like, blacksmiths and that sort of thing. So, but the southern slaves, the plantation slaves in the South, which were the majority, they've been non-slaves from the 1860s. Many of them moved up north, where the Jim Crow stuff didn't really apply. But the Jim Crow stuff put a standard on the slaves where you had to be able to read and write if you're going to vote, and given that many of them were insufficiently literate to do that, then they couldn't get the vote. So this was put forward as deliberately preventing blacks from voting. It wasn't really that's an overstatement here. But if you look at the amount of time that the black people have been in the United States and how much, and they're all surrounded by white people and access to white technology and white governance and white laws, they've had all of that. Yet still their behavior in the downtown areas of Baltimore and Chicago, the behavior is almost exactly like the behavior of the black gangs in Africa. So I invite anyone to show me the difference. It's the same. They're still behaving just like they did in Africa 400 years ago. Even the ones, not everyone, of course, even the ones who again, the many that were already free in the 1860s and were free from the early 1860s, from the early 1800s. So they've been free citizens in a rich white society for over 200 years, and still they can't make a go of it. And it's these sort of people that are going to be the majority all across the West. in the very near future, 30 years away. And that's a sobering thought. You've been with Tacitus today, your Pushback channel. Thank you for listening.